Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event. My name's Colin. We're just going to give people a few minutes to join the Zoom and come in. Hi to people who are just joining us. Hi, everyone. Hi, Roxanne. Hi, Julie. Hi, Beverly. We're just going to give people some time to join us, come in, and it's a nice day. Weather's nice. Hi, Hero. Hi, everyone who's just joining us. We are just starting. We'll start in a few minutes. We have some people who are just joining the Zoom. Sometimes it takes a little while for Zoom to cooperate with people and letting people in and audio and everything. And I think we'll start in like a minute or two, or so just hang in. Take a look at our title slide here and think of any questions that you might have or thoughts or anything, or general ponderings about life, the universe.
Is the picture on the left your house?
No, that
sorry.
is, that's okay. That is not my house, but it's a house that I'll be talking about. It's like
Cool.
3 houses technically, I guess.
Yeah, it looks like somebody's poorhouse.
This event is being hosted by the Community Breakfast Collaborative, which is a local nonprofit group based out of Villanova and Radnor. The Community Breakfast Collaborative is an education nonprofit that hosts an annual Undoing Racism Breakfast Day. That the date is on the next slide. It's a great event. We just had a strategic planning session last Saturday, I want to say. Time is escaping me, dates and numbers and everything. So welcome, everyone. I guess we'll get started. Unless just going through here to get all the Zoom things set up. Just see this. Move this Zoom down. Anne, do you think we should get started?
Yes, as soon as you're ready.
Okay. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our Zoom event. My name is Colin McCrossan. I am the inaugural scholar in residence for the Community Breakfast Collaborative. This presentation is titled Slavery and Public Space in Mainline Philadelphia. Today's date is Thursday, April 20th. We have 3 pictures on the title slide that we'll get to. They represent kind of the 3 case studies that I'll be talking about to explore this history. So let me start my timer. So as I was saying, as people were joining us, the Community Breakfast Collaborative is a local education nonprofit. This is a screenshot of our board members. I want to thank them all for this position that I've had and for hosting the event tonight. They host an annual Undoing Racism Day breakfast, which is an event. It includes a panel that usually discusses some sort of topic related to racism and anti-racism. This coming year's date will be Wednesday, September 20th from 7:30 till 9:30 in the morning. And you can register for the breakfast and learn more about it on our website, which is communitybreakfast.weebly.com. So just to give some background on who I am and this position, my name's Colin McCrossan. As I said, I'm from Ardmore, so I'm from the area. Sorry, let me hit that on the Zoom. I went to school, undergraduate degree at McGill University, which is in Montreal. And at McGill, I was a part of a student team researching McGill's ties to slavery. So this picture of this statue is a statue of James McGill. He was a Canadian Scottish fur trader and enslaver. And this woman, Dr. Charmaine A. Nelson, led us to investigate McGill, his personal ties and the school's ties to slavery. So this was in 2020. So that's kind of how I got interested, how I started learning about slavery in Canada. Then I started looking at slavery in the Philadelphia area. I graduated and the pandemic had started, and I read this book by Gary Nash. He's a historian who has now passed away, unfortunately. This book is from 1988. It's called Forging Freedom. And in it, he talks about this enslaved girl and this enslaved woman named Paul and Phyllis, who escaped from their owner in Haverford Township in 1778. And this is the ad that he references that I later found. I'm not going to be talking about these 2 tonight, but I've talked about them in previous presentations with the Community Breakfast Collaborative. But this is how I got started. This is why I got started, researching and looking into this topic of slavery in this area. I was, wondering, why had I never learned about Paul, Phyllis, or the man Hugh Queen who enslaved them growing up in Haverford Township? Why did I never learn about slavery? Reconsidering my own educational background. So those are the questions that I had going into this research. Then I started the graduate program, the master's program at Villanova University. And I've kind of continued that research of slavery in the greater Philadelphia area. I've worked for the Rooted Project, which is Villanova's institutional history project. It's an initiative that's examining Villanova's connections to slavery, segregation, gender discrimination, religious prejudice. This is a screen clipping of our website, which is now going to be hosted by the library. So thank you to the Villanova librarians. Then I got connected with the Community Breakfast Collaborative. So I from Ardmore, just to recap, I went to McGill. I came back here. I was researching slavery at McGill. Then I started researching slavery in Philadelphia in the mainline area. And then I enrolled at Villanova, fully funded master's degree. And so I've continued that research, and I got connected with the Community Breakfast Collaborative, which has really allowed me to share this research and to talk with people in the public about slavery. Also, a part of this is examining my own whiteness, my own upbringing of why I never learned about these topics, why I never thought of myself as having a race or being racialized or learning about American society in certain ways. So it's also been a personal kind of learning as well. So tonight's talk, that's just to give us a sense of like, who am I? Why am I researching this? What are my credentials? All that kind of stuff.
What's his name?
Tonight's talk is going to be about slavery and public space in the mainline area, in mainline Philadelphia. I'll get to the key argument and the main ideas. I'm going to explore this history through case studies, through 3 separate kind of, examples to show us about slavery and public space. I'm also going to highlight some of the sources that I'll be using, methodology of how historians work, how they interpret the material from the past. And I want us to think about locating this space and reading it in our communities in our area today. Then I'll have a conclusion with some questions, and then we'll go into question and answer. So, slavery and public space. Slavery is an essential part of the mainline area's history, and there are sites and spaces of enslavement located throughout our area. What you're looking at on the right here is a map that I've started just plotting points, sites of enslavement. So what I mean by site is a specific location where it could be a historic house, a park where I know that white people owned and enslaved Black people. Space, however, is just a more general area that could be around that site or a part of someone's historic property where these enslaved people were moving around, where these enslavers were living. So that's just to give us kind of the definition between site and space. They're connected, but they're also different. So there's all of these sites and spaces that I started uncovering in the mainline area, but they're not marked. People don't know about them. The public consciousness of slavery, especially the white public consciousness of suburban Philadelphia, does not know about the history of slavery in the United States or really in the mainline area in a comprehensive way. And what I mean by that is they can't, if you asked an average white person in Berwyn, tell me about slavery in Berwyn, they might look at you and go, what are you talking about? So a part of this is looking at the history of these communities, but also about the history of enslavement in this area, how it's affected us today, but also how it's all around us. It's unmarked. These sites and spaces include parks, whole neighborhoods, historic homes, private pools, all where white people owned and enslaved Black people. So the last part of the argument is that when we acknowledge this history, and when we start discussing it, I think that it raises complicated questions about public memory, institutional histories, our communities, and also site and space usage. For example, one of these sites I'll be talking about is now a wedding venue. It's a historic house that's used as a wedding venue. What do we think about that? Should people be getting married and celebrating and having parties where people were enslaved? So those are some of the questions that I'll be raising throughout the presentation and that are related to the topic overall. So, okay, is everybody still with me? Okay,
Yes.
good. Our first case study is about this family, this white family and the Black people they enslaved named the Havards. They lived in Tredyffrin Township, which is in Chester County, still a part of the main line area in my view, because it's kind of suburban Philadelphia still. So there were 5 siblings, a part of the Havard family, who all enslaved Black people who were named Harry, Judith, Bina, Quan, Jeffrey, Dorothy, and some enslaved Black people whose names I don't know. The sources don't record their names. Some of the sites and spaces where these white people enslaved these Black people include a part of Valley Forge National Historic Park, Valley Forge Middle School, Duportail House. It's apparently, that's pronounced Duportail, not Duportail, and Pickett's Post Swim and Racket Club, which is in Tredyffrin. So this picture is a picture of Duportail House in Tredyffrin, which is the home of John Havard Jr., who I'll get to in a few moments. So this is really complicated and confusing to look at, but let me just explain what we're looking at. This is kind of a family tree of the Havards. The sources that I'm using to create this include the family's wills, their deeds, and genealogical reports. So the first guy in the family who was an enslaver was kind of this patriarch named John Havard Sr. He married 2 different white women and had these children and more: David, Samuel, John Havard Jr., Sarah, and Anne. John Havard Sr. enslaved 3 Black people at least, Sil, Lorada, and Ishmael, that were recorded in his will and estate inventory. These are all his kids who were also enslavers. David Havard, for example, enslaved a Black woman named Bina, a Black man named Quan, and he lived in this house, which is now the Pickett's Post Swim and Racket Club. So this is just to give us an overview of some of the people in this case study I'll be talking about. So, how do I know where these people lived? It's a big question that I've been kind of struggling with a lot of this research. I research an enslaver, but I don't know where they lived, or I know this enslaved person lived in Willistown in Chester County, but I'm not sure where they were enslaved. Chester County's archives, which is funded by the county, which is great, did this whole project, which we're looking at a screenshot of, which is a property atlas. So what they did was they took all the records of all these historic deeds and mapped the boundaries of them onto properties today and onto contemporary maps. So that's how we know from the archives, from this whole project they did, about where these people's property boundaries were. So it's a really great resource. I encourage everybody to go explore it. It's called the 1777 Chester County Property Atlas. So this highlighted section and each of these little white blocks and rectangular shapes were all of these Havard siblings' properties. They inherited them from their dad, John, when he didn't die, but he gave them to them before he died. So if anybody recognize, this is Valley Forge up here, Yellow Springs Road. This is Chesterbrook, the Chesterbrook area. This is Tredyffrin Township Municipal Building down here. So this is the area that I'm going to talk about with this case study. The first guy, a part of this family who was, excuse me, an enslaver, part of the Havard family, was Samuel Havard. He enslaved at least one black man named Harry. So he received 200 acres from his dad, which is here. So where Wilson Park is, Wilson Farm Park, and also Valley Forge. This whole zone was his 200 acres. We know that from Chester County's archives. He was a farmer, so he was, raising livestock, growing crops, doing agricultural work. He enslaved Harry and another man, which could have been Harry, and also a black woman whose name we don't know. The location that I have written down of where he was living and enslaving these people was Lafayette's quarters, which is the house that he lived in, and also Wilson Farm Park, this whole area, okay? And this is a neighborhood down here, so it's this whole space. So it's a few sites, the house where he was, but also the space around the house. So how do we know that he was an enslaver? Well, he posted this fugitive slave ad for Harry when Harry freed himself from Samuel Havard on April 1st, 1764. As everybody if you're not familiar with what fugitive slave ads were, I think a lot of people are, thankfully, due to the work of historians. They were advertisements that white people paid and wrote. They wrote them and they paid to post in newspapers that described enslaved people who freed themselves from them and ran away for, and throughout, slavery in the United States and the Atlantic world. So they're really important sources to capture and that captured enslaved people's resistance. So that's kind of another big idea that I want to talk about tonight too, is enslaved resistance, that enslaved Black people did not passively accept slavery, that they resisted in a whole type and, a ton of different ways. Freeing yourself was a really dangerous way to resist enslavement and the people that enslaved you, because it carried with it a lot of bad consequences. If enslaved people like Harry were recaptured, they could be punished, sold, their lives would change. Any white person, Black people did not have any legal rights, any kind of social, political rights, formally in Pennsylvania for a long time, up until the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And, you could argue today that Black people still don't really enjoy full citizenship. Samuel Havard recorded this ad for Harry, and I've transcribed it on the right here. He says, "Run away from me, the subscriber, on the first day of April. Harry, a mulatto fellow, about 24 years of age." So mulatto, again, is an offensive term, to refer to someone who is of mixed race ancestry. I'm going to say, the offensive term, not to be offensive, but just to be historically accurate. And there's whole debates about doing that. He took with him all this clothing. Okay. He had, a coat on with horn buttons, thick set breeches with metal buttons, brass buckles on his shoes, a linen cap. Samuel Havard's offering a reward of 40 shillings if the person who's capturing Harry captures him in Pennsylvania, and £5 if not. So that's how we know that Samuel Havard was enslaving this guy in Chester County in Tredyffrin. We also know from tax assessments, these are the sources that we're looking at here from the late 1760s, the 1770s, and 1781, that Havard was also enslaving other people. So I have circled here, here's one Negro man in his tax assessment. Here, later on, he's enslaving one Black woman who's referred to as a Negro wench, which is, again, an offensive term. And here in 1781, he's enslaving two musty slaves who have a taxable value of 60 pounds. Okay, so that's kind of the level of dehumanization that 200 acres of land, that land we looked at, was actually worth more than these two people. Okay, so that's also to bring up a content warning that the material of slavery is disturbing, it's upsetting, it's complicated. So, feel free to leave at any time if this is too, intense or upsetting. Samuel Havard was also a Quaker. The Havard family, they were a big Quaker family. They were originally from Wales. And Quakers in slavery, there's a long history to it. They were always kind of individual Quakers who were opposed to slavery in different ways, different forms. Really, the mainstream of white Quakers pretty much said these people are crazy. We have no problem with slavery. We might not love it, but it's a part of what we do, who we are. William Penn, was an enslaver. There were Quaker merchants who were the top slave traders in Philadelphia. So there's a long history. By 1776, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the people in charge of the Philadelphia area Quakers, decided, after a lot of debates and a lot of activism and a lot of resistance, to prohibit slaveholding among its membership. They said, you cannot be a Quaker in good standing and also enslave Black people. You can't do it. So they were going to enforce this new policy that they created was they directed each local church, each local meeting, to form committees to go to enslavers to convince them to free the people they enslaved. And here I have at the bottom of the screen, I'm kind of a visual, like, mapper type of person. So they would form committees, then they would meet with slave owners who a lot of times would they were resisting these meetings too. They would say, oh, we're not home. Oh, I can't make it today. Come back tomorrow and we can talk about this. And they would meet with them and try to convince them to free these people that they were enslaving, which is like a tall order for, if you're asking a slave owner, no, you have to free this person. And the slave owner has enslaved this person for 40 years. And they see no problem with it. So there's different outcomes. If they didn't agree with the meeting and the committees met with them, they say, you know what, we're throwing in the towel. They're going to keep enslaving. They'd be disowned. But disownment didn't necessarily mean that you couldn't still practice or worship at a Quaker meeting. It came with social stigma. It meant that you couldn't hold any kind of leadership positions. There'd be official minutes written into Quaker records that you were disowned. But it's kind of, historians are kind of saying that it's a complicated result, that they could still, very few people did, but so the outcomes really varied. Some people did comply with membership, with the leadership, and freed the people they enslaved. Some people didn't, and they were disowned. Samuel Havard, was resisting like the whole time, and he was one of the first people to be disowned from the meeting. What we're looking at here is a source from the Quaker meeting minutes from the Haverford monthly meeting, which was the kind of monthly meeting, the kind of second level of church organization. And the meeting minutes say that Samuel Havard is enslaving this guy. He's 40 years old, and he's rejected the labor of his friends. So the committee that's come to talk to him, he's rejected them, and he condemns their care and concern. So he's like not having any of them coming to try to convince him. He says that the guy he's enslaving, who's 40 years old, has left his service and gone off with the British Army, and that Samuel continues to refuse to provide for his freedom because he might return, and then he'd be an expense and Havert's perspective on me. I'm not sure, I don't understand that, but and he says he expresses a dislike and opposition to our proceedings for the benefits and relief of these injured people. So he's not, the person he's enslaving isn't even there at his property, Havert's property. He went off to the British. Even still, he's like, I'm still not going to free him because he could come back and I could still enslave him. Another source confirms that Havert's the person he enslaved did actually run away to the British lines. The British offered kind of enslaved people freedom. They said, if you flee to our lines and come join us. And in reality, it oftentimes didn't mean freedom. It meant a lot of different things. But anyway, here we have one Negro slave listed in a kind of tax return, or kind of this document is called a British depredation. And people like Samuel Havard said to Chester County, we want all of this money because the British took these things from us when they were coming through Tredyffrin. So that's what we're looking at. And he wanted the county to give him back 130 pounds because his Negro slave, quote unquote, ran off to the British. So that's what we're looking at. That's the source. I want you guys to think about how to interpret these sources from this enslaved person's perspective. This source was written by the county, and the other source was written by the Quakers, talking about Samuel Havard and this person he enslaved. But what could those meetings have been like for the person he enslaved when this committee came by, for other people, or this enslaved person who decided to take their own destiny into their own hands and said, you know what, the British are here. I've heard about it. I'm out. I'm leaving. I'm gone. Samuel Havard, whatever, and he left. This guy left. So thinking about how to interpret, sources from different perspectives and using different lenses. That's what historians do all the time. So that's the highlight of this enslaved person. So he's disowned in March 1779. This is just the minute. They say, we, testify that he's separated. It's kind of lengthy. It's kind of wordy. They're like, a lot of religious language, and pretty much he's disowned, March 1779. So where did Samuel Havard live? That's what I'm kind of interested in as well. He lived in what's now today known as Lafayette's quarters, which is kind of three homes joined together. And this is in Valley Forge National Historic Park. It's called Lafayette's Quarters. It's pretty remote. It's a remote section of the park, and you go down this kind of path. And when I was going down last week to take pictures, I'm like, it's kind of weird because it's very isolated. There's nobody really around. And then you get to this house, which looks like this, and it's like completely empty. This section where it's red on the side here, this is the section that Samuel Havard lived in and that he had built. This is a stone on the side of it that's indicating the date. So this is what we're looking at. Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, when he was a part of the Valley Forge campaign, he stayed in this middle section, which was built later during the campaign. So that's why it's known as Lafayette's Quarters, but he didn't live there full time. It was actually this guy, Samuel Havard. How do we know this? Where am I getting that info from? Here's another view of the house, and that's a clip of the National Park Service website. Well, there's all these things called historic nomination forms, where people from the public or from organizations or government agencies create these reports to nominate certain structures to national historic registers or to state registers because of their supposed historic value. So one was completed about Lafayette's Quarters, and they provide sources and evidence that it was actually Samuel Havard's house. They say that Lafayette's Quarters were established in the farmhouse of Samuel Havard, constructed in 1763, blah, blah, blah. It was 2.5 story, it had an attic, and so on. And he says Lafayette said it was a small barrack, which are scarcely more cheerful than dungeons. And that's his opinion. And he's an officer and wealthy guy, a wealthy white guy. And he's saying that, yeah, it was pretty much like horrible to live there. And so think about this enslaved person. How bad must it have been for them if the wealthy white French guy who's in the top brass of the military saying, I hated living there, even for a short amount of time. And this guy's enslaved, Harry. But again, he escaped. He freed himself. Another part of the space of Samuel Havard's property is Wilson Farm Park. So it's just south. This is where the site Lafayette's Quarters is, this little black kind of triangle in his property. Then south is this whole park. So they didn't live in what's now the park. Samuel Havard and Harry lived probably day to day in this house, but they were moving throughout this entire space, his whole property. So that's why I want to kind of, highlight site and space. There's this site that we know that was a site of enslavement, this house, but also this space. Harry didn't just stop being enslaved when he would go south on the guy's property. Okay, so these whole spaces are kind of marked and a part of this history. These enslaved people, Harry, I want to kind of read this history back into the landscape. Think about these people's lives and this history in the landscape today where there's no information about it. If you go to this house, there's nothing about Harry, nothing about this ad. If you go to Wilson Farm Park, it's just like, it's a park. But what happens if we take this fugitive ad and we superimpose it on the current space today and say, what would it have been like for him to run away in this rural wooded environment where there's a creek, where it's hard to kind of get your bearings? Where in April, what could the weather have been like? So that's kind of what I want to do with some of this history. So I have a few more Havards. I'm going to kind of go by them a little bit quickly just because I have more evidence about Samuel Havard. This is his brother, John Havard. We know that he was an enslaver from tax assessments, as we see in the bottom. He was also disowned from the meeting because he refused to free the people he enslaved. Here are the Quaker committees saying that John Havard holds a Negro man in bondage, about 27. This is when they're visiting him. He says that the practice is wrong in general, but he offers weak causes for declining to grant liberty to this person. And his wife is totally with him. They're like, Miriam, she's totally with him. So, it's going to be a struggle. Well, eventually they were disowned because they didn't agree. They didn't free that man. They lived in what's today called the Dupertale House, which is pictured here. We know that from historic resource forms, like we just saw from Samuel Havard, but also from the website and the history that the site that's now there interprets it as. They say, history of Dupertale House. In 1740, a Welsh Quaker named John Havard Jr. built a stone farm hut, blah, 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 and the fertile fields, so on and so forth. So this is how we know that he lived here. We know from the website, the current interpretation, deed records, historic resource forms. This is kind of disturbing to me. I'm going to be honest, because here we have people just kind of celebrating and living it up in a wedding and reenactors, and this is a site of enslavement. So step back in time and relax in this circa 1740 farmhouse. That's what they're advertising. But there's violence, there's resistance, there's enslavement that's a part of this very house, this space, this land. And you can rent it. You can rent out the house for your event. The Dupertale venue rental includes the use of the first floor, the second floor, the beautiful grounds, tables, chairs. You can have your wedding ceremony at the property at no cost. You can have cocktail hour in the barn, and it's open every Sunday from 1 to 3 p.m. year round. That's Dupertale House. Anne Havard, one of the sisters, one of the women of the family, was also an enslaver. We know that from tax documents like that's pictured here. She was a seamstress. She enslaved at least one woman named Judith, and her property that she shared with her sisters that they were given by their dad is where Valley Forge Middle School is today. So Anne Havard, we know that this woman she enslaved's name is Judith because she registered her in 1780 with Chester County. So this is a little bit of context. Pennsylvania was the first colony / state to pass a law to end slavery. And it was called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. There's a lot of sections of it that are pretty much just like, the king is doing all this stuff and revolutionary rhetoric and etc. The main part of it said that children born to enslaved women after the laws passed would not be enslaved for life. They would have a term of slavery or an indentured servitude. So they still owe their life, their labor, and their time to the person who enslaved their mom until they reach the age of 28. Okay. Those who were enslaved before the act, like Judith, you're still enslaved for life. You're not free. So the law didn't free anyone immediately. It also required that every slave owner register the people they enslaved with the county that they lived in to make it official. But there are all these loopholes of the law. Some people didn't register the people they enslaved. Some people were saying all sorts of stuff to get around the law and to keep enslaving. The law said that if you were coming from out of state, within 6 months, the people that you're enslaving would be free. Well, people like George Washington, who enslaved people like Ona Judge, were like, okay, well, I'll just stay in Philly until 5 months and 28 days, and then I'll send those enslaved people back to Virginia, Mount Vernon, to get around the law. And they're like, yep, totally legal. So it's just like, keep in mind, too, that some of the enslavers themselves were helping to draft the very law that was about slavery. So a little bit of conflict of interest there. Anne Havard complied with the law, and she registered in 1780 a Negro woman named Judith, aged 20 years, a slave for life. This is a picture of the register. So that's the source. That's the source based off of the law. That's why Anne Havard's doing that. And that's why we know that she enslaved Judith. She died in 1786, and she freed Judith in her will. Now, what we're looking at, the image on the left is this like monstrosity of a will. It's like extremely difficult to read as a source. Thankfully, some gentle, kind soul in the past transcribed the original will, and we have a transcription. So I'm not going to read all this, and I know it's like a lot of text and people don't like a lot of text, but I'm just going to read this part about, she says that she's giving a legacy to her Negro slave named Judith for her faithful attendance on me during my ill state of health. My will is that she be manumitted immediately after my decease, if the laws of Pennsylvania will allow it, without embarrassing my sister, her heirs, etc., or troubling them. Pretty much a lot of white legislators and politicians constantly said about slavery, we can't free enslaved Black people because they'll become a quote unquote burden to white people because we'll have to take care of them, which is assuming that they can't take care of themselves, they're inferior, all of that racist garbage. So she's even saying this in her will. So that's kind of the power of those thoughts, that language, the discursive power of this kind of white opinion of slavery, that it's trickling down to seamstresses like Anne Havard in their will. So she says that if, she becomes a burden, essentially, that I give her 20 pounds so that she won't kind of be a burden to my sister or other people in the community. Not 20 pounds like because I owe her 20 pounds, but 20 pounds because, oh, my sister, she might have to provide for her, which is like, what? So that's this will. That's how we know that Judith was eventually freed in 1786. Anne's sister, Sarah, who also lived in the same property, she also owned that property. She was also a seamstress. She enslaved a man named Jeffrey and a girl named Dorothy, who's 17 and Jeffrey was 27. She also registered them in the 1780 register. Sarah was disowned from the meeting. It's unclear. I haven't found in the minutes anything about Anne. So I don't know if she was hiding, if they did disown her, if she complied or what. I'm not sure. They lived their property. They lived in this space. I don't know where they lived, where their house was, but they lived in this space where Valley Forge Middle School is, in the whole neighborhood. So what does it mean that middle schoolers are going to school and they don't know about Judith? They don't know about Jeffrey. They don't know about Dorothy. They don't know about Anne Havard. That slavery was a part of this space, and now it's a school. It's a track. It's people going to class. It's learning about this. What does it mean that this is literally a part of the whole entire area? The last Havard sibling was David Havard. He enslaved more Black people than his siblings through tax assessments. We can see that down here. He's enslaving 5 Negroes, 3 men, 2 women. It seems like the tax assessments show that he was kind of selling people or freeing them, or eventually he actually complied with the Quaker leadership. He was the only Havard sibling to actually free the people he enslaved. Why? I don't know. Historians, we don't know everything. The sources can't tell us everything about enslaved people or enslavers. The Quaker meeting minutes, they're summaries of these interactions. They're not transcriptions. So it's unclear as to why David Havard did this, but he did. He freed 2 people he enslaved named Bina and Quan. His house and property is where the Picket Post Swim and Tennis Club is today. So this is a manumission document. This was the official Quaker record that says, I, David Havard of the Township of Tredyffrin, do hereby set free from bondage my Negro woman Bina, aged about 60. So she's 60 in 1778, and she's survived enslavement, and she's 60 years old, and she's finally becoming free. After all these Quakers are like, David, you need to free these people, meeting with him over months, years, and he's resisting. Then he finally says yes. And what would freedom have been like for Bina and Quan? I mean, it's not like they can just go out and say, oh, well, I'm going to start a family, get a job, do everything I want now. Like, they don't have citizenship. They don't have, economic, opportunities. They are kind of really in a difficult place. So he did free them on November 5th, 1778. This is the site today where David Havard lived, the Picket Post Swim and Tennis Club. The Picket Post Club, from their website, is a private boutique swim and paddle tennis club located in Chesterbrook, PA, offering memberships for individuals and families throughout the Delaware Valley, a great club for year-round family fun. But this house, like, in my mind, there's just and I don't. So let me just say too, I haven't made this research public. I haven't contacted any of these groups or organizations yet. I have with other historic sites and things. But what does this mean that we're just swimming? I mean, here you can see the house. Here's the house, and here's the pool. Like, we know from historic resource forms, like the other siblings, that this is where David Havard lived, this house. Okay, so that's just kind of to review 3 historic homes and 1 site from the Havard family. Okay, let me get a little bit of water. Is everybody still okay? And
Yep.
I know I'm talking pretty quickly. This is the second case study. It's about a white family in kind of Lower Merion, Haverford Township in Radnor, named the Humphreys family. Charles Humphreys was kind of the patriarch of this family, and he was a white politician, a landowner, a delegate to the Continental Congress, and an enslaver. He enslaved, along with his 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Rebecca, 9 Black people whose names were Thomas Crail, Caesar Waters, Judy Miller, Nanny, Nancy, Alice, Fanny, Tommy, Dolly. They lived in this kind of area. So this is from another kind of historic mapping project. This is from University of Pennsylvania. Here's Charles Humphrey's land in Ardmore. Okay, so right near Haverford College. We know that he lived here from other deed records and his will, that he lived in this area as well. So he owned land in Lower Merion and Haverford Township. He also owned this section of land in Radnor. So this is kind of confusing because this is from the Penn site of they map just like the Chester County Archives of everybody's land of what they own. So, I mean, it's a big property these people had in the past of, over 100, 200, 300 acres. We know that he enslaved these people because he, like the Havard family, complied with the 1780 law. This is his section of the registry. And here is a transcription of the people that he enslaved. A Negro woman named Nanny, Caesar, Tom, Nancy, Judy, Dolly, Alice, Tommy, and Fanny. Tom, so escaped, just like Harry did from Samuel Havard. The people that Humphreys enslaved, like Tom, were doing all sorts of different types of labor. Humphreys had a farm. He was also a politician. He was going Philadelphia, excuse me. So these enslaved people like Tom would have been performing both domestic and agricultural and kind of personal care labor. They would have been helping to dress him, taking care of his, livestock, taking care of themselves. Tom resisted in a really dramatic way, just like Harry did, by escaping. And Charles Humphreys wanted him back and paid to have posted and circulated this advertisement describing him. And he says, ran away the 22nd day of July, 1781 from Charles Humphreys, living in Haverford Township, Chester County. Haverford Township was a part of Chester County until 1789 when Delaware County was formed. So that's why it says Chester County. A mulatto man named Tom, strong and well set. He has black bushy hair, rather dark complexion. He is well dressed when he left home. He has been moving about Philadelphia and in the marsh meadows as low as Chester and the Hook, and he passes himself for a free man. Any person bringing him home or bringing him to his master shall have 3 silver dollars, not just regular dollars, silver dollars, and any other charges that you've accrued paid by me. So this ad is really remarkable because of its detail, because of Tom's resistance, because Tom forced Humphreys to record his life, details about his personality, his appearance, his, strategy for becoming free in this ad. So a lot of historians have written about how enslaved people were continuing to practice African cultural traditions with their dress, with their hair, with music. Humphrey says that he has black bushy hair, so Tom obviously was growing his hair a little bit longer. He has a blemish on the site of one eye caused by the sting of a wasp. Historians read that and kind of say, was it really a wasp that stung his eye and that made it, kind of damaged? Or was this physical abuse from Humphreys or someone else? Or did he trip and the conditions of enslavement, if he hit his eye, were so that his eye would never have, really fully recovered? Going back to interpretation of sources. And then he's passing himself as a free man. Humphreys was a delegate to the Continental Congress, the first meeting of these white politicians to kind of debate whether or not the colonies should separate from, England, to declare independence and all of that. That's what people grow up, reading and learning about in school, not people like Tom. Tom had his own ideas of what it meant to be free, of what independence meant, of liberty, justice, equality. We only get a snippet of that from the ad, okay? And the ad is not written by Tom, but we know that he was well-dressed when he left home. Is this a strategy to kind of make himself look wealthier? And he passes himself for a free man. When Humphreys would be talking about all these things, Tom would have been there. Humphreys likely brought Tom and these other enslaved people to Independence Hall or Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, where these debates were taking place. They would have been outside or taking care of the horse or the carriage or, shining something or going off and meeting people, while Humphreys was inside. That's what I want us to think about with this ad of, history. White historians have really written Black people out of a lot of national narratives of the United States for a very long time. But when we look at individuals and case studies in this area, we uncover all these amazing things and really complicated histories. So Tom was eventually recaptured and re-enslaved. Unfortunately, he did not become permanently free from his escape. We know that because when Charles Humphreys died, he actually freed him in his will. So he escaped 1781. Humphreys died 1786. In his will, it's very long because he was very wealthy. He freed Tom, Caesar, and Judy, these 3 people he enslaved, but 6 months after his death. So in his will, he said, they'll become free 6 months after I die. So even then, it's still this gradual manumission. It's not immediately free. The only person he immediately freed, who he enslaved, was this very old woman named Nanny, who I doubt that was her actual name. I wonder if they just called her that. I'm going off of what historians have said. If she was supposed to be a wet nurse or if she was supposed to do domestic things, and they literally just called this enslaved Black woman Nanny because she was a nanny, but she actually had a name, like a different name. I'm arguing. Judy's children, he said, would become free when they turned 21. I'm not sure if Tommy was one of her kids. He gave them money, clothing, objects, and land. He gave Caesar, Tom, and Judy 10 acres of land in Radnor. And he said, Caesar will get 3 of them. Tom and Judy will get 7. And my executors must have a house built for them. Okay, so this is pretty exceptional. Like, most enslavers did not free the people they enslaved, let alone give them money and objects and land and everything. So, I'm not sure what to make of this exactly. Humphreys is a complicated kind of, he's a Quaker. He was a Quaker. He's very, learned, all these debates. He's very wealthy, but he's giving them land again that they were working, that they improved, that they changed. This is the land that we're talking about in Radnor that he owned. We know this from deed records. And this is a reconstruction from a historian, a local historian in the 70s, who mapped these deed records with other people of Judy Miller, Thomas Crail, and Caesar Waters' land in Radnor. So right where the Bryn Mawr Hospital is, just a little bit below that on the map, this is where, according to the deed records, these people's land was that they were given to by Humphreys. So after they became free, at least Caesar, Tom, and Judy, they created new lives. They created new names. They tried to, survive in these new conditions that, it's not total freedom, as I was saying before, but it's not enslavement. Caesar became Caesar Waters. He married a Black woman named Phoebe, and they had a daughter named Charlotte. Judy adopted the name Judy Miller, married a man named James, and Tom became Thomas Crail. How do we know this? How can we trace their names and kind of who they became? Well, the deed records of their property and other related records actually record the dual names, and we can interpret them as logically knowing that they changed their name. So, for example, Thomas Crail eventually sold the land that Humphreys gave him in his will to someone else in 1799. This is that deed record. And it says, this indenture, the agreement made 1799 between Thomas Crail, called Tom a free mulatto, and Effie his wife, all that land in Radnor being 1/2 of 7 acres of land, which Charles Humphreys gave him when Thomas was known by the name of Tom, and he gave, Humphreys gave land to Judea, which is actually Judy. And they, according to this deed, they split it up. Thomas and Judy, they split up the land, the 7 acres they got. So how do we know that Tom became Thomas Crail, that he adopted this name? From this deed record that says, this agreement's between Tom, but he's now known as Thomas Crail, but he was enslaved by Charles Humphreys, who gave him this land, so on and so forth. So that's kind of this one really gem of a source that shows us that he adopted this new name. These now free Black people, Thomas, Judy, and Caesar, they were also a part of a community, a growing community of Black people in the area. And Richard Allen, who founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, visited Radnor and the Waters couple twice. First in 1784, he describes in his autobiography that he was really tired. He was walking to Radnor to preach, and he came upon the Waters couple, and they greeted him, and Phoebe Waters, washed his feet, and they prayed with him, and he stayed with the couple. And then he later went on to preach to what historians and what we think was likely an interracial audience. Allen came back again. We know that from Allen's autobiography. Allen came back again in 1797, and we know that because of a white Quaker farmer named Joseph Price, who kept a diary in Lower Merion, and he made note of this. So Joseph Price's diary is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is what it looks like on the left. He recorded all sorts of events and stuff going on in the area. And he says on April 26th that a preacher, a Negro man preached named Richard Allen, a very great preacher of or belonging to Methodists, above the Buck. So Buck Lane in Haverford Township, it's named after this tavern, which is called Buck Tavern. And we know that from a few historians have written about it and some contextual advertisements. Caesar is, still living above the Buck, so in that area in Radnor, and that's where Richard Allen came to, according to Joseph Price in 1797. Price also says a day before, he was making a coffin. So Price was like an undertaker. He was also a local politician. So he made a coffin for Humphrey's old nanny, perhaps 90 years old in 1797. So we have a record of when, at least the time frame of when she died. So she survived enslavement, at least 10 years after she was technically freed. This case is, Nanny's life is just so remarkable because she survived the brutality of slavery from the Humphreys, the material deprivation, the family separation, the constant surveillance, the physical abuse, the mental torture for like decades. And then she passed away. But we only know that from this white Quaker farmer who, it's just kind of like a note that he was keeping. And the diary is this amazing source because Price he can get very reflective and philosophical, but he's recording these things. So Nanny, was likely illiterate and didn't keep a diary. And even if she did, white archivists and people running historical institutions wouldn't consider that to be of value during this time to preserve. So this is the source that we go off of. It's not by Nanny about her life. It's not by Caesar, but we can read against the grain and kind of use these small bits and situate them in context to interpret these people's lives. So that's the section about Nanny, and this is the section about Caesar. Caesar Waters also eventually bought more property in Radnor Township, but he became indebted to other people who held sort of the mortgages to the property, these other white people in the area. He died in 1829, and there's kind of all these legal documents that were filed in the Delaware County Orphans Court about his property and who would be owed what, and so on and so forth. And that's how we know that he eventually, changed his name, that he got married, that he had a daughter. And that's this source that we're looking at here, an excerpt from the Orphans Court file for Caesar Waters. Their property today is where Bishop Richard Allen Park is. So this park, I've also been working with people from the Community Breakfast Collaborative with Radnor Township to develop a sign that is going to be a historic marker, an informational sign about these people, about Richard Allen, about Charles Humphreys and slavery in the area. So that's where this specific history took place. But Humphreys owned like essentially a ton of Ardmore. I mean, where Ardmore Junction is, where Merwood Park is, there's a Humphreys Street that's named after the family. So we know about certain spaces, like where Richard Allen Park was where Thomas and Judy Miller, where they owned land. But this whole entire space was owned by Humphreys, and where he would have been enslaving them as well. They didn't live, just like people today, didn't live in just one area or one spot and just didn't go anywhere else. So these spaces are all kind of a part of this history as well. Charles Humphreys was also buried in the old Haverford Friends Cemetery, which his grave is pictured there. And they have a community garden that's also in the back of that, not in where people were buried, according to the meeting, but behind it. So slavery is a part of so many spaces that people are, living through and doing stuff in today. So the last case study, this one's going to be a little bit shorter, is about this white guy named Richard Willing and 4 Black people he enslaved named Molly Richardson, Ishmael, Harry, and Richard. Richard Willing was a wealthy politician who also lived in Haverford Township. He was a lawyer. He was also a farmer. He was born into an extremely prominent white Philadelphian family, the Willing family. This is his dad on the left, who was mayor at a time, Charles Willing. And this is his mother on the right, who also came from the Shippen family, which is a wealthy Philadelphia family. His brother and his dad were slave traders. And the location where he lived and owned property is around kind of Richland Farms Park in Haverford Township. This is a little info about his dad. His dad was the 38th mayor of Philadelphia, and he was a slave trader. Part of my most recent research has been about Philadelphia's historic mayors and their connections to slavery. He was also a founder and trustee of Penn. He was elected to the city common council. He was a judge. He enslaved at least 4 Black people named Chloe, Venus, John, and Litchfield. And this is one advertisement one slave sale advertisement from his slave trading, where he's selling several likely Negro men and boys, also rum and sugar. And this is from Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. This is his will. That's how we know that he enslaved people like Venus. Richard Willing, though, didn't live in Philadelphia full time. He moved to Haverford Township, where tax assessments reveal that he owned 337 acres of land, which is just like kind of, I don't know, mind-boggling, because it's this enormous amount. And he enslaved at least these 4 people because he, like the other people that we've talked about, the white enslavers, registered these people in the 1780 register, so to make it totally legal and official. So that's how we know their names and that he enslaved them in their approximate ages. It's difficult to kind of ascertain enslaved people's exact ages because white enslavers didn't care really about their exact ages. They didn't record their birthdays. There are some examples of bigger plantations in places like Jamaica where there are account books of recording births, but that didn't happen here. So we have very little information about the enslaved people because of the way that sources were made. Okay, because when they're recording 1780 register, it's Richard Willing kind of ascertaining or estimating their ages from his own opinion, and then the county going, okay, fine, that's it, whatever. In 1790, this is the 1790 census, he's also enslaving 3 Black people, which is down here. So that's how we know he was an enslaver. In his will, he said that his executors could sell everything a part of his estate, except for his household furniture, his linen, his plate, which is kind of fine china, and his Negroes, which he gave to his wife, Margaret Willing. So this is, again, the level of dehumanization that these enslaved people are being, just considered movable property objects. The historians have talked about this inherent contradiction within chattel slavery, chattel meaning that you own someone in perpetuity for life, because enslaved people were legally considered to be objects, but a chair has no emotions. If you have a plate, they can't talk to you. So there's all these tensions within slavery of enslavers considered these people to be movable property, but then, all of a sudden Tom's freeing himself and he's running away. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't add up within the slavery kind of logic. Richard Willing's executor was his brother Thomas Willing, who was also a slave trader and a merchant and a politician. He was also the mayor of the city at one time. He kind of he created this account book about the estate, which is at the Delaware County Archives, which looks like this document. I just want to briefly talk about the process of the research. So I go to the archive, I request this document about Richard Willing. The document's like 80 pages long. I take pictures of every single page I can. Then I download them to my computer and I format them. This is from Adobe Acrobats. This is what the account book looks like. These are all the pages in the 18th century cursive. So then I have to look through the book, kind of read through it, interpret the language, get a sense of the person's handwriting. And then I come upon that there's all of these people that the estate executor, Thomas Willing, is making payments to. One of them was this woman, Molly Richardson, who I am 99% sure was the woman Molly that Richard Willing enslaved. Now, why do I think that? Well, he's also making other payments to formerly enslaved Black people in the book. And kind of all of the contextual evidence kind of points to the fact that this is the same woman. The estate is making these payments to her. She's kind of supporting Margaret Willing as a cook. She was paid $579 37 times over the course of 5 years. The account book doesn't say this is Molly Richardson. She was enslaved by Richard Willing, but her first name is Molly. There are a few Black people in the area, and other people in the book that they actually say they were formerly enslaved by him. Molly Richardson, the estate she died in 1804, and the estate paid for her coffin and funeral expenses at a African church, a local Black church in the area. I'm not sure which one, but this is just more evidence that Richardson, when she became free, was practicing her own religion. She was forming, meeting people in community. She had survived slavery, and she was, doing her own thing. She was living her own life. She was also renting a room from another Black woman in the area, which the estate is making a payment of. They said paid a Black woman balance due her from Molly Richardson for rent after they sold all of her things. So the estate took her bed and effects, and they sold it. And then they said, okay, we'll give you her rent money now that she's due, because she's no longer with us. Harry and Richard were two other people Richard Willing enslaved. Harry was disabled from slavery. This is saying Harry, a Black man, they're paying him to procure clothing, he being destitute, and from an injury to his hand, incapable of labor. That's what the estate's making in 1805. Another reason that I think these people, and Molly Richardson was Molly in the 1780 register, is that in this entry from 1808, Thomas Willing is making a payment of $6 to Richard, a Black, parentheses, formerly belonging to Richard Willing. He's paying him for a cord of wood. Okay, so that's kind of why I'm arguing that these people are the same people that he enslaved in 1780. So the area where Richard Willing lived is Richland Farms Park in Haverford Township. How do we know this? Well, the estate put his farm and estate up for sale. Thomas Willing did. This is an advertisement from 1799, I believe. And they're saying, come buy this farm. It's called Richland, the residence of the late Mr. Richard Willing in Haverford Township. It's convenient to several mills. Westchester Road, which is now Westchester Pike, passes through it. The account book also says that Richland was what he called the farm, Richland Farm, which they sold to George Willing, which I believe was a nephew. I'm not exactly sure from the records. Later on, this is a map from 1880, the area in Haverford Township, here's Westchester Road, is still being referred to as kind of Richland, the whole kind of area of the estate. Right here, County Line Road, here's Richland. Here's the Grange Estate. So that's what we're looking at here. There's also a historic resource form about this property that was actually demolished, a portion of which I think was where Richard Willing lived, this portion right here. This was demolished in, I think, the 90s. It became an apartment complex, but that's another piece of evidence that is telling me that Richland refers to Richard Willing's original farm, Richland. This is where the Richland Farms Park is today, on Westchester Pike. So here's Lowe's, here's the Quarry Center, here's Giant, and here's where Richland Farms Park is. Here's what the park looks like. It's pretty small. I think they could probably do better as a township in making a better park, but that's neither here nor there, but I guess it's here. There's also a street named after Richland, and I wrote about this in an op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer, just that features kind of this really nice image that the newspaper made about this farm. And I said that, this is where kids play and families meet. And this is where Willing enslaved Molly Richardson. There's violence a part of this space, and resistance, and this history matters. So we are at an hour time. These are just some of the questions that I kind of was alluding to during the presentation of how do we acknowledge this? How do we kind of create awareness about it? What does it mean that these spaces, these sites are connected to slavery in direct ways? Is it appropriate that people are getting married at Dupert Tie House? I just saw a news article about people taking selfies and posing on the railroad tracks leading into Auschwitz I, the extermination camp. This is not a presentation about the Holocaust or Nazism, but it's a comparable history of violence, of genocide, of human suffering, of, trauma. What does it mean that people are going to Valley Forge Park and they're not aware of this, or that kids are going to school or playing in Richland Farms Park where Molly Richardson was struggling to survive? What role should local governments or school districts or individuals play in engaging with this? Should we expect more from our elected officials to research this history, to make, more diverse American history matter and relevant to our communities? And then what do you want to learn more about? This is kind of the end of my term as the scholar in residence for the Community Breakfast Collaborative. And I want to thank the group for the position and for all the support they've given me over the past 2 years, and for you all that, attending tonight. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen. And for the question and answer, if you could just raise your hand, and then we'll call on people, I guess in order that we see the questions. I know that was a lot. I kind of talk really fast, and so yeah, and feel free to leave, if you want to stick around for questions. And I will put my email in the chat if people want to contact me afterwards. So yeah. Thank you all for coming. Yes, okay, I'm seeing one. Okay. The name is Mahik, but I don't think that's your full name.
Yeah, my name's Mary Ann. Hicks is the last name. I'm sorry, it's not coming out right. I had a question about the last case study you did about is the Mr. Willing, who paid different amounts of money for Molly. What was the money exchanged about, or what was that exchange about in relation to the slave Molly?
So Molly, after Richard Willing died, Molly eventually became freed. It's unclear how, but she eventually became freed. Richard Willing's estate executor, Thomas Willing, his brother, made a payment from the estate for her kind of work as a cook and her support of Richard's widow. So that's what it says in the document, that that they were paying her for her support and as a cook. So was support, that could mean a lot of different things. So that's, she's still working. She's working for the widow, but she's free. And the estate was making payments to her afterwards.
I mean, at least, not that was something, but it was a little, right? That she was freed, and they were giving her some money from his estate, correct? Okay.
Yeah, that is correct.
Good. Yeah. Thank you for all this work. It's beautiful. It's an amazing project. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Maureen, good. Sorry, the Zoom just moved.
So this is maybe a two-part question, and that is a curiosity on my part for the research that you've become enveloped in, certainly from undergraduate and now into your graduate program. Do you have a vision of what you would like to do with this information and how to get it out there to the general public and the local public and Pennsylvania history and so on, so that it isn't, just left to a young historian's work that somebody else would need to explore? That's one question. And the second question is, I'm guessing if we don't know the history, that means that African-American histories and people who are ancestors of these slaves who've lived here probably don't know it either. And I'm wondering if part of your research includes meeting with or studying with, research with some of the African-American churches in the local areas to see if they know of people who know more stories that you can build upon what you've already gathered.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I'll be interning this summer with the Lower Merion Historical Society, and they have an all new board. And I hope to kind of develop public resources and curriculum resources about kind of this history and to put it on their website. It's difficult because, to publish in scholarly journals, most people don't have access to them.
Exactly.
They're behind paywalls. And so I want to get stuff on a website and just really sources that are transcribed so people can do research and learn about these people. Second part, I do know Reverend Carolyn Cavanis, who's the pastor at Ardmore Bethel AME, but I want to connect with more Black organizations and Black churches and people in the area because, you know, growing up, as I said, the project is also about examining my own whiteness. And I grew up on George's Lane in Ardmore, and I had no idea there was even a historic Black community in Ardmore until I started researching any of this. And I'm like, wait, why is, you know, the neighborhood like this? And why is there residential segregation? And so that's a part of something that I want to work on in the future and hopefully connect. So yeah, it's, you know, and it's hard to kind of make stuff relevant, you know, of people of any race, of like, how do you make history relevant and interesting to people? So thank you for the question. Lisa Sharon Harper. Sorry, I'm trying to read the names.
That's great. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. I love the specificity. I love the way that you used the stories of the families, and also your historical strategies for trying to get into the mind and body of the enslaved. So just thank you for that. That was really valuable. I have a question, actually 2 or 3 questions. The first is, you gave us these stories of families. And so now we know about Thomas and Nanny and others, but do you have a sense of the scale? Do you have a sense of how many people were enslaved in the Philadelphia suburb? And I wonder also, what do you think are the current day vestiges of this in the communities? You started to kind of talk about that in Ardmore, but do you see current day ties to the current situation and decisions that were made in the past?
Well, thank you for your kind words about the presentation. In terms of scale, historians have this is one book, Freedom by Degrees, by 2 historians. They kind of, the scale, the numbers, the research in this area really hasn't still been done. So in terms of, they kind of write about Chester County in general, and it's in the hundreds of enslaved people. It's not really in like the tens of thousands, but it's not in the dozens. I hope, if that makes, you know, it's not really a good answer, but it's not this, but it's not that. And in terms of the vestiges, I mean, you know, all of American society is government, the economy, you know, racism goes back to slavery. So it's inescapable wherever you are. Just as, you know, Native American genocide and other topics. I mean, it's embedded into every part of American life. When you look at the local example, that's what I'm curious about, of like, when we look at this place that's now a pool house and it's in a wealthy white community where all these white people are kind of enjoying, and you know, some people that are non-white too. I don't know the exact membership of the pool. But I think the way that suburban whiteness in this area has worked is that white people don't even think about the history of their spaces or anything beyond, oh, well, this is where Marquis de Lafayette lived. And I'm like, but what about the guy who actually lived there, and this other guy, Harry? And, you know, why is it, one of the questions that I've been trying to think about is why in my own upbringing, everybody I knew was pretty much white. My community was totally white. You know, I didn't know anything about non-white people, history, places until university. That's a big problem. And I'm trying to learn about it. There's millions of people who are resisting it, passing laws to make it illegal to talk about it, censoring it, you know, criminalizing it. So there's, you know, I'm like, oh, you know, wouldn't it be great if we talked about this and tried to get it into the curriculum of, you know, to different school? But there are people on the school board who are like, if you mention the word diversity, it's a crime, literally. So that's, and I want to kind of, one of the projects I want to do with the internship is kind of think about an oral history project for the Ardmore Avenue School in Lower Merion, which is a segregated school, because people don't know about racial segregation, residential educational segregation in the North. You know, a lot of people, especially white people, they think slavery just means South Carolina And even that, they can't name an enslaved person or enslaver and all of the kind of, so that's why with this research, I've really tried to focus on individuals of like, who were these people? You know, what were their lives like? How did they change? Like, they were someone like Molly Richardson. She had this whole life. Like, there are all these sources about her that have existed since 1799 in the county courthouse. I didn't, you know, they're not just newly available. Like, all this stuff has been around, but nobody's been asking the questions, and at least in this area. So there's a lot of like, I guess, you know, still more work to be done, and we don't know everything. And, you know, people in the future might say, oh, well, actually, we think differently about what they thought about slavery in Philadelphia because we just, you know, this new theory came out, or we have this different way of understanding it. So, yeah, I hope that kind of provided some info.
It does. And I just wonder if I can add one thing. Is that okay?
Yep.
So you said there were only about 300 people who were enslaved in that area, but it's
sorry, a few hundred.
A few hundred, which usually would be about 300, but what's like 200 to 300 or so?
It could have been more. I don't really have an exact number, so.
Okay, no, that's okay. So, but a few hundred as opposed to a few 100,000 or million that were in the South, right? But we don't think of it in terms of scale. In that area, there really weren't that many people who lived out there. And in the North, most people who had enslaved people only had 2 or 3 enslaved people. So if you have not that many people and you have most people having 2 or 3 enslaved people, that basically means everybody was enslaving somebody.
A lot of people, yeah.
Prevalent in that area. That's striking.
Yeah, and some townships more than others, which is a question that I have. And some people more. Charles Humphreys, you know, they're enslaving 9 people. That was a lot of people. And the scale, you know, people have argued to me and said, oh, well, because the scale is lower, it matters less, which I'm like, no, that's total garbage. But the scale actually historically means something different. If you're one enslaved Black girl of a family of 6 white people on a farm of 300 acres and woods, what your day-to-day life is totally different than somebody who's enslaved by a tavern keeper on the edge of the Delaware River in Philadelphia. The social interactions, the, you know, day-to-day kind of structures of everything, totally different. Like, and today it might be an hour's drive. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm just excited by this. And the vulnerability of that girl.
Totally. And the surveillance and kind of somebody like Harry, who is escaping from Harvard, when you go to the space today in Valley Forge, like, it's still kind of a little bit rural, you know, because it's a national park. So what I want to do too is have people kind of imagine these people in this space again. You know, what does that look like? And to think about these people's lives, like, and then, oh, we're just enjoying, we're having a wedding. And I'm like, but what about Bina and Kwan and David Havard and all of this? So thank you for your comments and for taking us to those other kind of aspects of it. Would Bolden?
I'd like to add, you know, the sense of, you know, what a great presentation this was. And it's particularly interesting to me because I'm marginally involved with Avis Wanda McClinton's project, which wants all that same information for 339 people. But I just wanted to ask, given the way you want to locate, you know, sites in space, it seems like you would have done something with the Humphreys family, you know, and when did they change Humphreyville to Bryn Mawr?
That was probably in 19th century, I believe. I'm not totally sure.
Yes.
Because the family, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It was the railroads that decided what to change the names.
Yeah.
Athensville became Ardmore. Humphreysville became Bryn Mawr.
But I mean, the Humphreysville is named for that family of Humphreys. So
yep. And there's a street street name. And I personally think, just rename it. The street name, it can easily be renamed. There's obviously going to be a lot of white resistance to renaming anything. But I'm like, I'm imagining too, what could it be like if school children in Lower Merion grew up learning about people like Alice or Judy Miller and these other people? And what about if we had public spaces or statues or memorials or plaques? They in and of themselves don't do a lot of education, but they still say that the local government, this local community says that these people matter, that there's value in their history. Like a plaque, it's not going to immediately tell 600 people about everything about slavery, but it'll at least say, hey, this person's important. And when you're here in this space, you should learn about them. And they contributed to our community, our country, all of that. Next question is Lorraine Carter.
Yes, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I was wondering, because you mentioned that some of these slaves, they might have been mulatto. I'm wondering where they might have, if you're aware of where they might have come from. Were they, and then also there was no reference or mention of any children any of them might have had. So either the enslaved or the enslavers. I'm wondering if there is who might still be around. And I did put in the chat that Richard Willing, and I believe you said his wife, that her family's name was Shippen. And I was asking because there's Shippens, generations of Shippens in Ardmore, and they're still here. And I was just curious to know if there might have been any affiliation. I don't know if you'd have that answer, but knowing that there are generations of them here, it's just a curiosity.
To answer that one first, I don't know specifically, but my advisor is writing all about Ardmore history and Black history in Ardmore, Dr. Craig Bailey, and he's given a few presentations publicly, and he's working on his book project now, and he's tracing a family, Judy Miller's family, and a few other enslaved Black families, and putting together all these disparate pieces from elsewhere in other counties and tracing them into the 19th and 20th century. So these people do, the family lines do exist. Mm-hmm. I don't know about them personally. He's doing some of that research, and he's at the point where he's like, I need to stop and gather and look at everything I've just researched and try to make sense of it. Your first point, sexual violence, rape, are a part of slavery, especially Atlantic world chattel slavery. The sources that we have, like the 1780 register, if it says there's a family in Haverford, not a family, there's a guy, Samuel Johnston, who was a farmer in Haverford Township. He had all of these young mulatto, quote unquote, kids he was enslaving. And then there's this Black woman who he's also enslaving. And this guy didn't have any wife or family or anything that I can find. So that source, the 1780 source, doesn't say that he raped this woman and that there was all this violence and sexual assault and horrible stuff going on. But we know contextually from what all these historians for decades have written that was just a part of slavery. And so, the source itself doesn't say that these kids were his and that they were related to him, but he's marking them as not being fully white and, being of a mixed ancestry. So it's really difficult to kind of talk about because it's so horrendous, and also to research because the sources, at least for this area, for the stuff that I've come across, you have to really do a lot of interpretation and theory. And, but there are other cases that are much clearer, throughout the rest of the United States and Caribbean and South America. But thank you for your comment about the Shippen family. Richard Willing, his mother was a Shippen. So his wife was actually from New York. Oh. And the account is they're actually paying for postage for letters of New York. But thank you, Lorraine, for your question.
Just one last question before we do that. You mentioned that someone is doing research on the Ardmore Avenue School. Or even the community there?
I want to
on that somehow, or
so there are a few people that have been doing research, I think, locally for a long time. Wendell Holland, I think, is one of them. the thing that I mentioned about that is I'd like to start an oral history project to record people's experiences, especially as they get older, with the Lower Merion Historical Society, with other organizations. That's one of my goals this summer, of like at least putting together some kind of a start of the project of like getting people's stories, making sure that they're recorded, because they're still alive. You know, like people from 400 years ago we don't know their perspectives, but you know, what was it like as a second grader going to a segregated school in Ardmore and living in this area at the time? So that's something that I want to do in the future.
Okay, so
There has already been an oral history project done through Lower Merion High School. So check in with the archivist or the librarian there. That was done in association with Lower Merion Historical Society when they had an event honoring the Ardmore Avenue School. So
Okay.
all done for an anniversary. So there's a beginning there that you can tap into.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm actually familiar with that. But the house that I live in is right down the street from what that school was. My house is older. My house was built in the late 1890s. And so there was the school, it burned down. There was another school that was rebuilt, that was demolished, and my house is still standing. So I'm
Wow.
always curious about that. So I'm familiar with that, but I was just wondering that when you do that research, whatever you find out, if you'll do another presentation like this one, I would love to be present for that. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, definitely touch base with the Palm Center in Ardmore. Right
Mhm.
now, there are a couple people who are over 100 years old who actually attend sessions there. That might be a good link to find out and to actually start those conversations with those people. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Lorraine. Dave N.
Hi, thank you first off for the presentation. Sorry, I'm wondering what the potential is for getting historical markers put up in connection with these sites that you identified. I'm putting that together with what you said about the move to squelch education in accurate history through some, efforts by local school boards and stuff.
Right.
Sorry, excuse me. And I remember being in a demonstration at one point, and school buses were driving by us, and students were taking pictures of us and our signs and what the signs said on their cell phones. So I just would love it if I would love to see markers identifying some of the people connected with some of these sites, pointing out that they should not be forgotten, that their contribution to the life of the community should not be forgotten, and that the history of the area that we live in is a steady history of struggle toward greater recognition of people's histories, rights, and freedom. I mean, I don't know how much you can get on a single historical marker, but one marker might say natives were edged off this land. The women who helped farm this land didn't get to vote until 1921. There were people enslaved on this land. There were union workers who lived and died, non-union workers who lived and died without the right to unionize for their own, organizing rights. Whatever can be embodied in a sign like that would help raise up the accurate history of the area in a way that would make it possible for students to see that stuff when they walk to school or drive by or sit at a traffic light next to one of these signs, and then hopefully take some questions to their classrooms. I mean, I can see a student going to the classroom and the teacher saying, I'm not allowed to talk about that. You have to go to the school board. And I remember when I was in high school, we did go to the school board about some stuff. So thank you for listening. Just wondered, so back to my question is, do you think there's real potential for getting some markers on some of these properties? You think there's support for it? Do you think there's a lot of opposition for it? What can we do?
Well, thank you, Dave. I think so. There's a few different kind of markers. There's ones through the state, which are Pennsylvania, they're blue, people have seen them. They're through the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. There's currently no marker submissions being allowed because of a controversy over an LGBTQ historical marker in Harrisburg and a conservative state senator and yada, yada, yada. So the state commission, they're not accepting any proposals. Private people, like submit and write proposals or organizations, and then they fundraise to have them installed. They're also, the township or the county can develop signs. They can host community meetings. They can talk to people. Some of these sites like the Dupertai House, I say the title is Slavery in Public Space because technically there's sidewalks and it's a neighborhood, but that's technically private space. So I think the first step would just be creating awareness about this history, which is also difficult to do, as we were talking before, of how do you share this? How do you make it available to people? How do you, keep it relevant and get people engaged? So I think there's different, then you could have things that are only digital. And so there's townships that can, develop signs. There's counties, the state, it's kind of up in the air right now. And your comment about history, I'm not sure that I agree totally, because I think we're going backwards right now. Even though time is going on, I think we're going backwards in a lot of different ways in terms of LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, racial injustice, I think, is increasing. Gun violence is certainly going up every day. So unfortunately, I don't think like we're necessarily going in, but I want it to. I want it to get better. I want these things to get better. I don't want them to get worse. And I think this, I think communities also have to meet with each other. I don't want this to just be me saying, hey, Radnor Township, you need to do this, because people have, different opinions and different histories and different knowledge that they bring to the process. And I'm kind of just trying to provide information to people and make these sources available and kind of put it out there that this person existed. I think that they're important, but there's debates, and these, if it'll be public funds or on a public site, then I think it should be like an open process. And I think people need to talk about it and learn about it. And there's different ideas. Maybe people don't read signs. Maybe, for younger people, it needs to be digital, or it needs to be a physical format for some people to get the information. So thank you for your comment. Brings up a lot of good points. So thanks for that. If there's nobody else, I'll stick around. I gave my email in the chat. Feel free to, if you have any questions or, you want to get in touch. Barbara, did you have a question or anything? Okay. I think you're still muted, but I'll try to unmute you.
No, I'm Barbara Cobb. Yes. Is that the Barbara you're talking about?
No, sorry. I'm talking about Barbara Klinman. Sorry, Barbara Cobb.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that a few years ago, I was in Independence Mall area, and there is a whole installation about slavery or the founding fathers. It's beautifully done. And that it's obviously done by Philadelphia. And it was well received, and it was, a lot of people were viewing it. It was, I think that people were quite interested in their history. I mean, that was pretty general in Philadelphia, and obviously in the spot where everyone goes to see about history. But I think Haverford Township has a rich history in many areas, and I would like to get involved with trying to bring it to the attention. I go to township meetings on occasion, and people bring up all sorts of things. I know there's federal funds available right now for different projects. So, it's like, raise your hand. Yeah, and I was just wondering where I could see your maps a little bigger. I could hardly see them. I'm very, very aware of the Bryn Mawr area because I worked there for 33 years. And exactly where you were talking about. But you had mentioned something about Richland Farm, and where is that exactly?
It's called Richland Farms Park. It's on Westchester Pike.
I think it's probably 3 blocks from my house, but I'm unaware.
Okay.
So I'm between Lowe's and the shopping center, Manoa. So Is it somewhere in there? I was trying,
Yeah, it's closer to the well, I'll put it in the chat, just the name of it, and just Google Richland
okay.
Farms Park
Okay.
on Westchester Pike. So yeah, your house probably sits on land that Willing owned because he owned 300 acres, in that whole zone.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing. The Independence Mall project. Oh, sorry, Lisa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask actually, or just suggest this, that I'm just thinking, I think another very worthy project, either for you or for others on this call or for other historians in the area, would be to take the enslaving families that you've identified and to trace them forward into the 21st century and ask, where are they now? How are they situated in the community? Especially, I think the Humphreys family, because it was such a big slaver comparably. What's their power like today? Where are they still here? Basically, to track the sense of heritage. How has the heritage of the advantage that they gained by having free labor for all those years, how did that actually benefit them? That could be a really worthy task.
Totally. I've been super interested in that question since I started because a lot of them kept family documents. They kept these archives. They kept slave bills of sale. They kept the documents of slavery. They kept all of these things up until the 20th century. If you go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is a big repository, and they all intermarried, a lot of these Quaker families intermarried with each other. So the names might be slightly different, but people can trace their histories back. And the wealth that they have, what are their lives like? I've been super curious. I don't know. I haven't been able to find a lot of stuff, but there are descendants, certainly. So yeah, that's a good topic that I want to, and other people too, like they might know, or their own family history. It's also, this presentation is also about what is your family history? How do you what are your own family documents and what is passed down, and what might not be passed down? White families that were slaveholding, the exception is we want to talk about it. It makes news when it's like Washington Post, white family owns up to that they owned 300 people. It's
That's
newsworthy because it's exceptional, because it's not the norm, because most people are like, well, if they're descendants, they might know, but they don't want to talk about it. Or, they might know that this happened, but, they don't want to engage with it because it's difficult. It's implicates them in all of these things. So it's hard to, if I did know someone, which I don't, how would I go about approaching them about this? I think it would help that I'm white, and that that they would be like, oh well, I might feel more comfortable talking to you. But I'm like, yeah, so it's another kind of parallel track of these other topics for sure.
Yes, and it helps with the question of the assumption of racial superiority, supremacy, and hierarchy. To understand you're not situated high up just because you happen to be the elect of God or because you are better. It's because of all that free labor and probably free land that you also got by grants way back when.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I might interject,
yeah, Hero, go ahead.
I found your story and relating fascinating and incredibly well done. What it reminded me, and you might want to share this with others, is the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, multi-generational, etc., and the impact it has had on a Quaker society, etc. And I'll just leave it at that, because you can find out tons of stuff along the with parallels to what you brought up in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hero. Yeah, great example. And I think that there's a recent book. I'll put the title in the chat. It's called Jefferson's Daughters. Just typing it out here. By Catherine Harrison. She was a professor at Villanova. She's now retired, but that's just kind of the, Annette Gordon Reed is kind of the expert on Sally Hemings, and she's a, full professor of history and law at Harvard. So, let me type her name too, just for people who don't know. She was the first scholar to be like, there's all of these descendants and people. And for a while, Monticello and the Jefferson family denied the DNA evidence that proved that these Black people were descendants of Jefferson. And it's been a whole controversy, as is what Barbara brought up, the Independence Mall. Originally, when the National Park Service around the turn of the 20th century was going to reinterpret the president's house where Washington stayed right in front of Independence Hall, they weren't going to talk about slavery at all. They weren't going to talk about Ona Judge or Prince or the other people he enslaved. And there's a book, I'll put it in the chat too. It's called Upon the Ruins of Liberty. And there was a whole controversy because Black community members and their allies pushed the federal government to actually acknowledge slavery at the site and Washington's connections to it. Let me put the book there. So yes, as Hero brings up, there's a lot of national figures that we can explore these topics because they were famous and wealthy. They have all these documents and descendants that make it easier versus someone who, might have lived, in Haverford, but, didn't leave a ton behind. Feel free, to stick around. I will still be here to keep answering questions, but I just want to give people a moment to leave if they want. I will answer Molly and Jean your questions. I just want to give people, because it is 8:45, just time to log off and thank everybody again for coming. And Ma Hicks, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name. Is it Molly? I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I just, this piggybacks off of talking about descendants of, say, Jefferson and Washington that were from unions with one of their slaves. In your research, did you see whether any of the wealthy landowners had any preferential treatment to possibly their descendants that were from the mix of a slave and themselves? Did in their wills, did they leave, say, was there any affection to the children that they had with these folks, either in freeing them or providing for them in any way?
I'd say just broadly, a general answer is it depends. Each case was different. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting if Jefferson did free Sally Hemings or her children in his will. I'm seeing nods. I need to read up and recap. I'm not sure if they did or not, but
No, he didn't. He didn't.
So he didn't.
He's freed one, but not all of them.
Okay, so there we go with Jefferson's
Not
case.
Sally. Yeah.
There are cases too of other people. I mean, so you bring a good point, and something that I want to stress too is that slavery was different even within these different households and communities, even though it was all in Philadelphia. As we were saying, Washington was different from a carpenter who might have been an enslaver. So we need to look, we need to be specific about who we're talking about and time and place. And it can change with all these different factors, the environment, the political situation, so it changes. There are some things that are universal, that chattel meant that this person was property for life. But there are these specificities within slavery that historians have been trying to parse out for many years of, how is this case different? And what about James Monroe versus James Madison or Jefferson, or even the enslaved people, their roles on plantations and their family lives and cultural practices. And, because the enslaved were such a diverse population, even from West Africa, they're coming from, so many different communities and kingdoms and tribes and backgrounds and languages that enslaved people might not know the same language or be from the same zone. Of course, from the white perspective, when they're creating Blackness from the white perspective, it's all the same, but in reality, it's totally different. It's diverse, changing, all of these things. So,
Thank
Jean,
you.
did you have your hand up just to give you or Mary Ellen, or whichever you wants to go first?
I didn't know how to make my hand except my hand. So I was wondering about Humphreys. Is that the same Humphreys or related to the guy whose house still stands on Haverford Road opposite the Pig and Whistle or whatever that railroad?
B&W.
Yellow house there, and he was a shipbuilder, which I would say must be a very wealthy guy. Well, was he the guy who owned slaves, or was his brother, or what's going on there?
That was, so Charles Humphreys, the guy I talked about. Joshua Humphreys, who lived there, that was his nephew. Charles Humphreys owned that house, which is called Pont Redding, and Humphreys in his will refers to the Pont Redding mansion and Pont Redding Creek, which he owned. So he Joshua Humphreys inherited, along with his two siblings, the majority of Humphreys' estate. Charles Humphreys, he was their uncle. Joshua Humphreys, the shipbuilder you're talking about, there's a marker. He lived there. Charles Humphreys had another mansion that was since torn down, according to his descendants in the 19th century. I do know that there's an enslaved woman who was a part of Pont Redding's history, though. Her name was Rachel, because at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, in the Humphreys family papers for Joshua Humphreys, is her bill of sale, which actually records her being sold when she's a young girl, about 5 years old, to a tavern keeper in Philadelphia. The tavern keeper, sells her to another person. That person gives her to his daughter. That woman married Joshua Humphreys. So this woman, Rachel, the slave bill of sale records her dying in the early 1800s, and says that she's buried somewhere near what's now Old Haverford Friends Meeting. That's what the bill of sale says. It says she's buried in the space next to the meeting. But I'm like, does that mean cemetery? Does that mean literally 5 feet this way? If she was buried in the cemetery, I would be surprised if she was buried in the white section, with the other people there. The Humphreys have a whole line of the people who are buried there. With this question of the community garden, is she buried where the garden is? Because it says she's buried in the space next to the meeting. I'm not sure what that means. I see Lorraine and Roxana.
Yes, I was just wondering, have you had an opportunity to speak to any of the students in the schools in this area, Lower Marion School District or Tredyffrin or any Radnor, any of the schools, the high school students?
No, not yet.
Well, I'm wondering because a couple of things. And are you aware that the Lower Marion School District has a committee to address race in education?
I feel like I heard about it, but I'm not familiar with them. No.
They do. They meet monthly. And I think the information that you're sharing would be very important for them to know, and especially for the students to know. And I'm wondering if you have anything. We're actually meeting with a group of students this Saturday at Saints Memorial in Bryn Mawr. And we're here just to meet with them to see what they're thinking, see what their experience is. And there's so much going on right now, even within Lower Marion relative to race. I don't know if you've seen what's going on in the news lately.
Well, I know that the police had tased the Black woman, I'm forgetting her name, and that was then they had suspended the officer, and there was a debate about the suspension. And
right. Well, I mean, even within the schools themselves over the last
no,
yes,
I'm not
really
familiar.
pretty serious stuff. And I'm saying this too because of the resistance that's happening around the nation in the name of critical race theory, which is really not taught in K through 12 schools, but there's resistance. And you've referenced a little bit today in terms of some of the challenges that you might have in sharing this information. But I did want to say before the session ended, I think it's very, very important for you to share this information because it's truth, and for you to share it as often as possible. And that's why I'm asking you about the schools and other organizations who are actually trying to make sure that this history is known, preserved, and shared. So those are a couple of groups that that are happening, that would probably even open the door for you to have an opportunity to present to community members at various venues and times. Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be great to connect with them. If you could put your email, Lorraine, send me a message in the chat just so I could connect with you after.
Okay, thank you.
Roxana?
Yes, Colin, thank you so much for everything that you're giving. The information is phenomenal. And I appreciate the fact that when you were using the word, you said the word mulatto, how it could give another kind of feeling when you say that, it's not really acceptable. I so appreciate that because I'm learning so much from more understanding the history of African Americans, to the point that there was a time in which we would call African Americans slaves. And I'm hearing you saying that they are enslaved. They are not slave, they were enslaved. And that there was a time in which you called the slave owners slave masters, and now you're saying enslaver. And I appreciate that respect of saying that these people are not slaves, they were enslaved, because that gives you another whole perspective of a human being. And I appreciate the fact that you were saying not slave masters, but enslavers, because that's exactly what they were. And I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate the way that you're giving that respect for these human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. Yeah, historians have kind of tried to tell people why the shift in language, why not just use slave or enslaved, and going from kind of static to action of, enslaved perspectives. And I think you summarized that pretty well, because a lot of people, that's how they grew up. They know slave owner, slave master, slave. But, a lot of what I tried to say in the presentation is even these people had names, they had identities, they had families. We don't know exactly day to day because we don't have the records, but we know from books like I just referenced, the historians are telling us these people lived on a farm, they were raising livestock, their name was Judy, and personalizing it. And I find it, I don't know, inspiring, because each time we say these people's names, we also kind of reaffirm their existence, their identity in the present. So, we're kind of saying, like, we don't forget about you. You do matter to us. We acknowledge you, even though you live these extremely difficult, harsh lives. We still remember you now. And I think there's a lot of power in doing that.
I appreciate the fact that you said you lived on, George's Lane?
Mm-hmm.
I lived on Aubrey Avenue. And it's very interesting that you said predominantly white. You're absolutely right, because of how difficult it was even for my grandparents to own property on Aubrey Avenue, how much of that area was redlined. So yes, absolutely, that entire area, George's Lane, St. Mary's Road, Oakford, I think it's Oakford Road, and all of that was white around Aubrey Avenue. So it's very interesting hearing you say about George's Lane, which when I was going to Chestnut Wall, that was one of the streets we were very leery of walking down to get home. Very, very interesting. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Roxanne. And I want to record those experiences in, this potential oral history project, and to, because people don't believe it either.
Mm-hmm.
White people don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, but Roxana lived through it every day.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
Jean, do you want to, sorry. I think you're still muted, Jean.
Okay. I just wanted you to reiterate the fact that all the tax records from the 18th century identify who the original settlers of Lower Merion Township were and Haverford Township, and they provide actual information on who owned slaves at that time. And that's all data that is there. It's just that it's hard to get to. And just because you're a lot younger than I am, I can tell you that we didn't have scanned newspapers when I was doing research. We didn't have we weren't allowed to go in and take a cell phone in and photograph an entire document. You had to pay to have it microfilmed before you could use it. I mean, so there is a great deal of information that has come forward to your generation that has not been available in the past. And I can tell you that I also did research for National Register nominations and worked on one in Kentucky for one of the earliest distilleries. And that distillery was owned by a man who had come from the Pennsylvania area and began it in the 18th century. And he had slaves, and nobody believed it because I found all the sale records in his wills. So that there is information everywhere. It's just that people haven't dug it up yet. And you've been taking it on as a very constructive, well-run, with good methodology in order to bring all of this to the fore. And I think the best way you can consider having people use the information at a place like Duportail House is have them have a little brochure or something that tells something about the history of the house and the former owners and the fact that they had slaves. The same thing is true of Appleford, right here in Lower Merion Township. That was another, they have weddings there, and that was an original farmhouse of one of the other families. So there's a great deal of history that has not been fully disclosed because people haven't bothered to go and do the research. And kudos to you and anybody else who's working on it. I'll be happy to fill you in on a few of the slave owners that I learned about in Lower Merion Township. Take care.
Well, thank you, Jane. And you raised a good point about accessibility of sources and the past, and technology has really helped with that. And one of the things that I hope to challenge everybody here to do is to ask questions about, the community that you're in and the places that you visit and the curriculum that your kids are learning or the memories that you have, and to, take it forward of, places that you visit, of asking about slavery or women or immigrants if you go to a museum or a site, or just talking about the history. As I said before, like creating awareness is like difficult to do, but it starts with us. I don't, Lisa.
Yeah, just very quickly, can you show us that book again before we go up?
Sorry. This is so this is one book, Freedom by Degrees.
Okay.
And then this is another book, the woman Erica Armstrong Dunbar, who wrote about Ona Judge. This is her first book about Black women navigating manumission in Philadelphia. It's called A Fragile Freedom.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And as people were saying in the chat, there's a new exhibit about the Fortin family at the Museum of the American Revolution, which was a great exhibit. I just went. It has amazing sources. You might also be interested in, this is kind of an overview book, Slavery and Abolition in Pennsylvania. Really great intro, and talks about, Black history in Pennsylvania going forward. There's a lot. There's so many. I'm just looking at my bookshelf. This is a great book. It's kind of out of print, but if you want a digital copy, I can send you one. It's called Blacks Who Stole Themselves: Advertisements in the Pennsylvania Gazette.
Yes, please do.
It's just full of, I have stuff circled and underlined and tabs of people that I'm like, habitual. This guy's from Springfield, Chester County, Caesar, this guy named Jack Jones, and he's getting on a boat and he's a privateer. And so yes, just send me your email in the chat, and I will connect you with resources and different stuff, because I also have academic library access where I can just download something and send it instead of people buying it on their own. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was going to say I'm an author, so I believe in buying the book.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Yeah, thank you.
I support the author, the publishing, a little less, but yeah, we do want to support authors and, pay them what they're worth and everything.
I gotcha.
But to share, to, we won't tell Random House that we're doing it.
All right.
So if there's nobody else, I want to thank everybody for coming again, and stay well, everybody, and send me your email if you want me to send you stuff. Just in the chat, just because I don't have your emails. So yeah, thanks again for coming. Have a good night.
Information.
Thank you for all
thank
your
you.
comments, and this will be online too. So if you missed something, or if you want to go back, and so yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Great.
Where can we find this online?
It'll be on the Community Breakfast page, YouTube.
Okay.
In a few days.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll email it out to everyone too.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Could I mention one more thing, Colin?
Sure. Yeah.
I haven't heard it mentioned, but there are dogs that are trained to identify old graves that are unmarked.
Oh,
Going back at least 150 years.
wow.
They key on chemicals which persist in soil and vegetation from bodies that have long disappeared. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. There's a group in Maryland which is willing to send dogs into the area up here, as part of their training program, and it might be helpful at a place like Old Haverford. I'm planning to keep it in mind. So thanks
Yeah.
for.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I know there's archaeologists also use kind of different technologies and
Yeah, right.
kind of ground penetrating. And so hopefully we can get more research about that with the technology.
All right. Lots to do.
Thank you, Jean, for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Colin.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne, for hosting. And should I log off now, or?
Yeah, I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.